He thought he'd erased her voice forever. One cold evening, Matthew burned every journal Claire had written over decades. Her memories, her truth, her proof. But what he didn't know was that she had been preparing for years, quietly building a backup that could destroy everything he'd built. Behind the perfect façade of their marriage lay a war of secrets, political corruption, and a plan he never saw coming. When her evidence hit the headlines, his empire began to crumble. This is the story of the woman who lost her words and used them to end him. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The air carried the sharp bite of early winter, the kind that made every breath visible. The neighborhood was quiet except for the occasional hum of a passing car. But in the driveway of the two-story colonial house at the end of the cul-de-sac, an orange glow disrupted the gray-blue dusk. The smell of burning paper drifted down the street, thin at first, then heavy. Filling the cold air with the acrid sweetness of ink and aged glue, Matthew stood by the metal fire pit, his shoulders squared, his expression almost serene. A faint curl of steam rose from the coffee mug in his left hand, while his right held the next journal, its cover worn soft from years of handling. Without ceremony, he dropped it into the flames. The spine cracked with the heat, the pages catching. Almost instantly, folding inward as if in surrender. He didn't watch them burn. His eyes were fixed on the fire itself, not on what it was consuming. Across the street, curtains shifted. A neighbor paused on her front porch, holding a bag of groceries and staring toward the fire. Another slowed his dog's leash, the animal tugging toward the smell. People noticed, but no one called out. No one asked what was being destroyed inside. Behind the large bay window that faced the driveway, Claire stood in the soft shadow of the curtains. She didn't move closer to the glass, didn't tilt her head to get a better view. Her hands rested on the back of the armchair in front of her, fingers relaxed, knuckles pale in the low light. She could hear the faint hiss and pop of the fire through the glass. From this distance, she could also see his mouth the faintest. Upward curve, not a smile exactly, but something close. Smugness was too crude a word for it. It was the expression of someone executing a plan they'd been rehearsing in their mind for years. The wind shifted, and a loose page caught in the air before being pulled back into the fire's core. The edges curled black, the center glowing, red before collapsing into ash. The box beside him was half empty now, the remaining journals stacked neatly, each one tied with the thin white ribbon she had used when she packed them away last spring. He reached for another. Claire stayed where she was, the distance between them filled with glass and air and years of things unsaid. She thought about stepping outside, about asking him to stop, but she knew how the conversation would go. His voice calm, his reasoning polished. Some things shouldn't be held on to. Or maybe it's time to let go of the past. Always framed as wisdom, never malice. And if she disagreed, the weight of his gaze would turn it into an accusation. Flames flared as another book caught. The heat shimmered in the air above the pit, distorting his shape for a moment. She could imagine the sound, the crackling of paper, the faint thud as another spine gave way, even if she couldn't hear it clearly through the glass. The journals had been in her life longer than he had. Decades of them, each holding its season of her life in ink and margins and pressed leaves tucked between pages. Now, each season turned to smoke in seconds. A neighbor's porch light flicked on. Somewhere, a door closed. The street returned to its evening rhythm, the fire's glow no longer novel enough to hold attention. Matthew didn't notice, or didn't care. He poured the last of his coffee into the grass, set the mug on the edge of the pit, and picked up the final journal. He turned it over once in his hands, not studying it, just feeling the weight. Then he tossed it in. Claire's gaze didn't follow it into the flames. She looked instead at him, his posture unchanged, his face calm in the flickering light. He wasn't just burning paper, he was making a point. She didn't move, didn't let her expression betray anything. If he looked toward the window, she wanted him to see nothing he could use. The fire crackled louder for a moment, then began to settle as the last pages darkened, curled, and fell apart. Ash swirled upward in the cold night air, carried off toward the dark trees at the edge of the yard. He stepped back, dusted his hands against his coat, and with one last look at the pit, turned toward the house. She stayed at the window, still, as the glass itself, until the front door opened and his footsteps crossed the threshold. The smell of smoke came with him. It clung to his coat, to his hair. Neither of them spoke in the eyes of the town. They were the kind of couple people pointed to as an example. They appeared together at charity auctions, her hand resting lightly on his arm, his voice warm and engaging as he introduced her to newcomers. Photographs from the annual Winter Gala always showed them in perfect alignment. She, in an understated gown, hair swept back, a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and he, in a tailored suit with a hand placed at the small of her back, as though to guide her, protect her, claim her at the grocery store. They moved together through the aisles, as if choreographed. He would take items from the shelf, pass them to her. She would place them neatly in the cart. People they barely knew would stop them to chat, remark on how lucky they were to have each other, how well they fit. They would laugh together then, a polished duet, the laughter blending just enough to look spontaneous. Their holiday cards were always mailed on time, the kind printed on heavy cardstock with a professional photograph of the two of them in front of a fireplace or under the blooming magnolia in their yard. She wrote the accompanying letter, full of news about their travels and charitable work, glossing over the months in between with vague phrases like, "We've been keeping busy, and life is full, but good." The neighbors, the acquaintances, the people in their social orbit, they all saw a marriage that seemed intact, enviable even. But inside the house, the air was different. Conversations had an edge to them, even when the words themselves were ordinary. It was the pauses that gave it away, the slight delay before answering, the way their voices didn't overlap. Everything they said to each other felt rehearsed. Each response calculated to reveal nothing, concede nothing. The kitchen, with its pale stone countertops and carefully chosen lighting, was often silent, except for the sound of the refrigerator motor or the click of ceramic mugs against the marble. He might ask if she'd remembered to pay the landscaper. She might remind him that the car was due for service. These exchanges carried no warmth, only the efficiency of two people managing a business together. Except the business was their life. On evenings when they had to attend a dinner or fundraiser, their preparation was wordless. He would select his tie, she would check her reflection for smudges of makeup. When they spoke, before leaving, it was to coordinate timing or confirm who would drive. In the car, they reviewed names of people they might encounter. Small anecdotes to mention, the correct alignment of facts so neither would contradict the other in public. At home, without an audience, they kept two separate corners of the house. He worked in his study, the door always open but the threshold an unspoken barrier. She stayed in the living room or at the small desk in the sunroom, her papers spread neatly, pen in hand. When they passed each other in the hallway, there was no friction, no outright hostility, just the careful avoidance of contact, as if proximity might set something off. Occasionally, they would eat together at the dining table. These meals were quiet affairs, the clink of silverware marking the rhythm of the evening. They discussed the week's schedule or the progress of repairs on the back fence, but there was no laughter here, no shared glances over the rim of a glass, save those for when people were watching. If anyone had asked her directly, Claire would have said they were fine. If anyone had asked him, Matthew would have said they were busy. Both answers were true, in their way. Busy enough to avoid the kind of stillness where truths slip out. Fine enough to keep appearances from cracking. Looked immaculate, trimmed hedges, fresh paint, windows that caught the morning light. But inside, the space between them was a landscape of brittle glass. Every conversation was a step across it, each word a calculation. How much weight could be placed without something shattering? It was not the kind of war that left visible scars. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors. The damage here was quieter, more deliberate. A constant low-level contest to see who could hold their ground without revealing what they were guarding. And because they both understood the stakes, neither ever gave the other an opening dot in public. They were seamless. In private, they were locked in a stalemate, so practiced it almost felt natural. Claire's first journal had been a gift from her grandmother. It was a slim book with a green cloth cover and a narrow satin ribbon sewn into the spine. She was 16, restless in a house where conversations rarely went deeper than school, grades, or dinner plans. The journal sat on her desk for weeks before she found the courage to write in it. When she finally did, It wasn't poetry or the melodrama she'd imagined other girls scribbling in theirs. It was a list what her father had said at breakfast, the way her mother's hands trembled when she poured coffee, the headline from the morning paper. Small, ordinary things, but already she sensed that if she didn't write them down, they would disappear. From then on, she wrote daily. Not because she wanted to create something beautiful, but because she had learned quickly that memory could be slippery and truth could be bent in someone else's retelling. The pages became her proof. She described scenes exactly as they happened, noting who had been present, the time of day, the words spoken. At first, it was about family life, the arguments that were later smoothed over, the promises that were later denied. But over the years, it became a habit she carried into every corner of her life. By the time she was in college, she had filled a dozen volumes. They were lined up on a shelf in her apartment, each one labeled with the year in neat block letters. In those pages were the details of her early friendships, the people she loved and left, the professors who shaped her thinking, and the jobs she worked to pay rent. She never edited herself, never softened the truth. If she'd been humiliated, she wrote it exactly as it happened. If someone had lied, she recorded their words. When she met Matthew, she was already years into this private ritual. At first, he found it charming. He'd tease her about how methodical she was, joke that she was keeping a case file on everyone she knew. She didn't correct him, because in a way, she was. But as the years passed and the marriage settled into its own rhythms, his teasing shifted into something sharper. He began to call her the scribe when she wrote at night, or he would glance at her closed notebook and ask, "Did I make the cut today?" In a tone that made it sound like a warning, the journals grew heavier in both number and weight. She stored them carefully, first in boxers at the top of closets, later in a locked cabinet in her home office. The covers varied, leather-bound, gifts from friends, simple spiral notebooks bought in bulk, hardcover sketchbooks that allowed her to paste in photographs or receipts. Some volumes were thick with pages where the ink had bled through from heavy handwriting, others thin and spare from years when she had to write in snatches of time. What bound them together was the way they held her voice, unfiltered, unadorned, immune to revision by anyone else. They were where she put the conversations that had turned sour. The moments when someone's story shifted between one telling and the next, the remarks made in quiet rooms that would later be denied. It wasn't just personal history. It was a ledger of every interaction she thought might matter someday. Over decades, the collection became an archive. The earliest ones were written in the rounded letters of a teenager, full of sharp observation and untested certainty. The middle years bore the strain of her marriage, longer entries written late at night, ink smudged from her hand, dragging. Across the page, more recent volumes were precise, almost clinical in tone, as if she were writing for an audience that would one day need to understand without question. When Matthew began to grow wary of them, she noticed he would ask casual questions about where she kept them, what she wrote about. She learned to answer without answering, to smile and close the subject. She never told him that the journals had outgrown the cabinet, that there were boxers in the attic now, each one labeled and dated. They were not sentimental objects to her. She didn't reread them for comfort or nostalgia. Their value was in the fact that they existed, a solid, tangible record that no argument or charm could erase. And though she never said it aloud, she had always known there might come a day when having the truth in her own handwriting could matter more than anything else she owned. That day would come sooner than she expected. It had been late spring, the kind of afternoon when sunlight poured through the upstairs windows in long, warm stripes. Claire had been sorting through a stack of old files in her office when she noticed the empty space. It was subtle, just a gap in the otherwise neat row of journals on the second shelf, the shelf she always kept in perfect chronological order. Her hand moved there automatically, fingers brushing the dustless patch where the missing book had stood. She didn't have to think about which one it was. The navy leather cover, the gold-edged pages. She had placed it there herself only a month earlier, after finishing the last entry. She scanned the other shelves, then the desk, then the small table near the window where she sometimes set things down. The journal wasn't there. She checked the lower cabinets. Even though she never stored anything personal there, each search grew faster, less thorough, fueled more by a rising sense of wrongness than by any real hope of finding it. When Matthew came home, she was still in the office, The desk drawers open, the carpet littered with small piles of papers she had pulled out in her search. He leaned in the doorway, loosened his tie, and asked what she was doing. She told him one of her journals was missing. He tilted his head, a practiced gesture of mild concern, and suggested maybe it had been misplaced during cleaning. She said she hadn't moved it. He smiled faintly and reminded her that the cleaning service had been in just last week. Maybe they'd put it somewhere else without thinking. She knew that wasn't true. The cleaning crew never touched her shelves. It was part of the instructions she gave them when they first started. No rearranging, no dusting between the books, nothing that could shift the precise order she kept. But she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded, as if his explanation might be possible, and said she'd look again that night. After he went to bed, she searched the entire house. She checked the storage boxes in the attic, the drawers in the guest room, even the locked cabinet where she kept older volumes. Nothing. She went back to the shelf and stared at the gap. She could see the other journals pressing against each other, the edges worn from years of handling, the thin ribbons of their bookmarks dangling over the sides like faint markers of time. The missing one was from the year 3 summers ago, a year she had written more than usual, a year when the tone of her entries had shifted from personal reflection to something sharper, more deliberate. She thought about what was in that journal. Notes from evenings out, details of conversations with people she and Matthew both knew, dates and locations of meetings he had told her not to mention to anyone. Things that might sound innocuous to an outsider, but to someone who knew the context. Someone like Matthew, they would read differently. The next morning she brought it up again, casually over coffee. She said she still couldn't find it. He didn't look up from his phone. "Then maybe it's gone," he said, his tone flat, as though the loss of something that had taken a year to fill was no more important than a misplaced grocery receipt. When she didn't answer, he glanced at her, his expression unreadable, and added, "You have plenty of others." It was the smallest shift, but she felt it. Something in the air between them changed. It wasn't just about the missing journal anymore. It was about knowing that he had noticed it, and that his reaction was not surprise, but dismissal. That was its own kind of admission. For weeks afterward, she found herself checking the shelves almost without thinking, her eyes drawn to the space where the navy spine should have been. Eventually, she moved the others over to close the gap. But the absence was still there, a hollow she could feel each time she walked into the room. She never found the journal, and though she told herself to let it go, the loss hardened something. In her, it became the quiet proof she needed that what she had been writing all these years mattered more than even she had admitted. Enough to be taken, enough to be hidden, enough to be destroyed. Matthew's anger never arrived in shouts or slammed doors. It came measured, deliberate, like someone turning a dial one notch at a time until the air in the room shifted without you realizing it. Claire had learned to recognize the early signs. The way he would lean back in his chair during a conversation, the slight narrowing of his eyes as if cataloging her words, the faint curl at the corner of his mouth when he believed he had found the weak seemed to pull. He rarely spoke in absolutes. When he was angry, instead, he dealt in implication. A question asked not to seek an answer, but to plant one in her mind. "Are you sure that's how it happened?" Or, "I don't remember it that way." He would drop these lines with an almost casual tone, his voice warm enough that anyone overhearing would think it harmless. But for Claire, they were sharp edges. It was in those moments that he reached for the past, choosing a memory they both shared and tilting it slightly, just enough to make her doubt her own version. He didn't deny outright, he from a tense. Dinner with friends became, in his telling, a misunderstanding on her part. A promise he had made and broken was, to him, something they had only talked about but never agreed upon. The events themselves remained recognizable, but the order of them, the tone, and he wielded it without raising his voice. He could take. If she pushed back, he would sigh and shake his head with a practiced air of disappointment, not anger. "You're being sensitive." In public, he never allowed these exchanges to show. Around friends or colleagues, his tone toward her was protective, even indulgent. If she misremembered something at a dinner, he would laugh and correct her gently, his hand brushing hers as if to soften the moment. It was only later at home that the correction would resurface, not as a joke, but as evidence of her supposed tendency to get things wrong over time. Claire began to feel the weight of these corrections before they were even spoken. She found herself editing what she said in front of him, choosing safer topics, avoiding the recounting of events entirely. When she did speak up, she measured each word carefully, knowing that anything left loose could be twisted back on her. This was the unspoken threat, not that he would harm her physically, but that he would dismantle her certainty, piece by piece, until she questioned her own clarity. The missing journal had sharpened this fear. She had not confronted him outright about taking it, but the knowledge sat between them like a locked drawer neither of them acknowledged. Whenever she caught him glancing at her shelves, it was there. When he asked what she'd been working on, it was there. And when he would, days later, casually mention something she had written years ago, it was there, the unspoken reminder that he had access to more than she wanted him to. What made it effective was the lack of escalation. There was never a single moment she could point to as proof, only a pattern, small, precise cuts that never bled openly but left her marked all the same. The result was control without force, compliance without commands. In the evenings, she would sometimes sit in her office and run her fingertips along the spines of the remaining journals. The row still intact, except for that single gap, she thought. Of them, as anchors, each one holding her version of events against the slow erosion of his. She never told him that this was why she wrote, or that she sometimes read back old entries just to steady herself. Matthew never accused, he never threatened. But every conversation carried the potential for him to reach into a memory and twist it just enough that she would feel her footing slide. That was his temper, precision, control. The quiet rewriting of truth until she was no longer certain where her version ended and his began. From disappearing entirely, Claire had never thought of herself as sentimental. She didn't keep childhood, toys and boxers under the bed, or press flowers between book pages for the sake of romance. It was a discipline born of necessity, shaped by the quiet lessons of her early life. She had learned young that memory could be manipulated, and that people, especially those who benefited from a different version, would not hesitate to alter the story if it suited them. Her first real lesson came before she could even drive. She had been 12 when a fight broke out in her family's kitchen. It was over something trivial, whether her older brother had been told to mow the lawn or not. But the argument escalated quickly, drawing in their mother and father until the original point was lost. By the end, her brother stood in the doorway, claiming the order had never been given. Claire had been there the entire time. She remembered the exact words, the tone, the timing, she remembered, because it was so ordinary, yet the outcome was altered completely in the retelling. She had felt something settle inside her, the knowledge that facts alone weren't enough if no one else was willing to remember them from then on. She began keeping small notes, not full sentences. At first, just scraps of paper listing what had happened and when. It was clumsy and unorganized, but it gave her a sense of security. She could point to something tangible, even if no one else cared to look. By the time she reached her teenage years, those scraps had evolved into full entries. At 16, when her grandmother gave her that first proper journal, she recognized its potential immediately. Here was a place where she could set down events in their exact shape before anyone else had the chance to mold them into something else. The act of writing became as natural as breathing. She didn't dress her accounts with unnecessary detail, unless it mattered. If she described the color of someone's shirt, it was because she knew the shirt would be mentioned later. If she noted the time of day, it was because the timing would contradict someone else's version eventually. Every entry was a small safeguard, a way to keep a moment fixed in place against the pull of revision. People often assumed journals were for processing feelings, but that was never her aim. She wasn't interested in spilling out every emotion onto paper so she could feel lighter. She wrote because she wanted the truth to survive in its raw form, unaltered by hindsight or persuasion. And in the years that followed, she saw again and again how quickly stories could shift when someone wanted them to. Arguments in relationships that morphed into, "I never said that," promises made over dinner that were later described as just an idea. Even praise, once given, could be retracted in memory until it had never existed at all. Matthew, in their early days, had been amused by her dedication. He would glance at her notebook on the nightstand and joke about how careful she must be to record every detail. She let him think it was just a habit, maybe even a quirk. But privately, she knew exactly why she did it. There was safety in the written word, her written word. That safety became more than just personal reassurance, of reality that she sometimes felt when they spoke. If he said something and later denied it, she could go back to the exact night and see it written in her own hand. The ink still dark, the page still firm. Even if she never showed it to anyone, the knowledge that it existed gave her ground to stand on. The collection grew over the years, lined up in quiet rows on her shelves. Each spine represented not just a stretch of time, but a ledger of events that could be checked against memory. In them were the small truths that might have been lost otherwise, the quiet proof that her life had happened the way she remembered it. It was never about reliving the past. It was about preserving it before it could be reshaped by someone else's. Hence, in a house where words could shift their meaning by the time the conversation ended, that preservation was not a hobby. It was survival. The house was full of the soft hum of voices and the clink of glassware. Candlelight reflected off polished wood and silver, casting a warm, flattering glow over the dining room. Outside, a thin drizzle tapped against the windows, the kind of rain that blurred streetlights and made the night feel more contained, more intimate. Claire moved between the kitchen and the table, topping off wine glasses, adjusting serving spoons, keeping the conversation flowing as smoothly as the music. Playing low in the background, Matthew sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed, his smile quick and easy. He was in his element when hosting, guiding the conversation. Claire had always admired this about him in the early years, the way he could make people feel as though they were the most interesting person in the room. But she had also learned that these gatherings were another stage, and he never wasted an audience. It happened between the second course and dessert. A guest had complimented the meal, commenting on how beautifully everything was presented. Matthew, without missing a beat, smiled and said, "Claire's got a system for everything. Even our arguments are filed and indexed somewhere, I'm sure." The table laughed. It was the kind of remark that passed easily as a joke, light, affectionate, a nod to her organized nature. Claire smiled too, the way you're supposed to in these moments, even tilting her head slightly as if to concede the point. But inside, the words landed differently. She could feel the sharpness under the humor, the deliberate choice to bring her private habit into public view. It wasn't the first time he had done it, but the tone tonight was different. There was something in the timing, the ease with which he placed the comment into the room. It felt like a reminder meant for her alone. She caught his glance after the laughter subsided. It lasted only a second, but she saw Itan almost imperceptible. Lift of his eyebrow, the smallest tightening at the corner of his mouth. To anyone else, it was nothing. To her, it was the signal beneath the surface. He was paying attention to what she kept, what she recorded, and he wanted her to know that he hadn't forgotten. The conversation moved on quickly. Someone brought up travel plans for the summer, and another guest launched into a story about a disastrous trip to Italy. Claire poured more wine, nodded at the right moments, and kept her voice light when she spoke. She felt the words of Matthew's joke still pressing against her, not in the way of a fresh wound, but like a bruise that deepened as the evening wore on. When the last guests had gone, the house returned to its usual quiet. The scent of food lingered in the air, mixed with the faint trace of rain that had drifted in when the door was opened for goodbyes. Matthew stood in the kitchen rinsing glasses, his sleeves rolled up. She stacked plates beside him, neither of them speaking. He didn't repeat the joke or explain it. He didn't have to. Later, when she went upstairs, she paused at the door to her office. She almost stepped inside, almost opened the cabinet to make sure the journals were all where they should be. But she didn't. She simply stood there for a moment, her hand resting on the frame, lying awake, and staring at the ceiling while the rain eased into silence. She thought about the way he had looked at her after the joke, about how public humiliation was never his style, was too obvious, too coarse. Instead, he preferred these small, polished barbs, the kind that could be passed off as charm, too. Everyone else but carried a private message she couldn't mistake by the time she drifted into a shallow sleep. She knew the remark hadn't been casual. It was a note slipped under the door, a quiet reminder that he was aware of her records, aware of what she wrote, and that if he wanted to, he could bring it into the open. She didn't yet know what he would do with that knowledge. She would find out the next evening in the cold light of the fire pit. It had started as an experiment. years before Matthew ever suspected her notebooks were anything more than a harmless pastime. One winter afternoon, when the house was empty and the quiet felt too heavy, Claire had pulled the first journal from the shelf and opened her laptop. The decision wasn't dramatic, no sudden fear, no particular incident, just a thought that had been lingering for months. Paper could be lost, damaged, taken. She had spent decades filling those pages, and yet all it would take was a fire, a flood, or a careless hand to erase them. She began slowly, typing each entry as it appeared on the page, resisting the urge to edit or clarify. Every crossed-out word, every smudge of ink was translated into plain text, dated exactly as it had been written. The process was tedious but oddly calming, a way to revisit the past without the risk of it vanishing. She told herself it was for preservation. But even then, she understood there was another reason: quiet mistrust of how secure the journals really were in her home. By the time she had finished transcribing the first volume, the habit had become a project. The title was deliberately dull, the kind of thing no one would open unless they were specifically looking for appliance manuals or tax records. Within that folder, she built subfolders labeled only by year. The encryption came later. A friend from her college days, now working in cybersecurity, he had been explaining it in the context of protecting financial documents, but she filed the knowledge away and applied it to her own needs. The password she chose was a combination of dates and phrases. No one but her could know things, buried so deep in her history they had never been spoken aloud. The digital copies grew in number as steadily as the physical ones. Whenever she finished a journal, she would wait a week or two before starting the transcription, spacing the work so it didn't draw attention. She never worked on it when Matthew was home. Sometimes she would take the laptop to the library, claiming she needed a change of scenery for correspondence or errands. Other times, she would do it late at night in the small sunroom. She transferred everything to an external storage. Device leak, black, no bigger than her thumb, and stored it in a safe deposit box 2 towns over. She kept the rental under her maiden name, paid in cash, and never mentioned it to anyone. The little drive rested inside a plain envelope, sandwiched between outdated insurance policies and an old silver locket her grandmother had left her over the years. She refined her system. Each journal had 2 digital backups, one on the encrypted drive in the deposit box and one on a second device hidden in a false bottom drawer in her office. The files were identical, updated meticulously, checked twice before she considered them secure. It wasn't paranoia, she told herself. It was caution. Matthew never asked about her time away from the house in detail. If he noticed the hours she spent at the library or the way her laptop sometimes wasn't where it had been the night before, he didn't comment. Perhaps he believed her work was limited to grocery lists. The words inside them had already been copied, preserved, and locked away where his hands could never reach. The paper might be vulnerable to fire or theft, but the real record was untouchable. In that knowledge, Claire found a quiet kind of steadiness. The backup plan was not something she dwelled on daily, but its existence formed a protective layer between her and the possibility of loss. It was her insurance against the subtle rewriting of history she had learned to expect, not just from Matthew, but from the world at large. And though she never imagined she would need to use it, she was certain of one thing: if the day came, she would be ready. It was a gray afternoon, the kind where the light seemed to flatten everything. Claire had left for the grocery store just after 2, her list folded neatly in her coat pocket. Matthew had been in the living room when she walked out, the television murmuring in the background, his attention split between the screen and whatever was on his phone. He barely looked up when she told him she'd be back in an hour. The store was quiet, the kind of midweek lull when the aisles felt too wide and the fluorescent lights too bright. A bottle of wine on impulse when she passed the display. There was no rush. The house would be the same when she returned, the kind of stillness that had settled between them over the years. But as she turned onto their street, she noticed the air. It wasn't the faint, woody scent of a neighbor's fireplace. This was sharper, heavier burning paper. Her stomach tightened before she even reached the driveway. The garage door was closed. The curtains in the front windows hung exactly as she'd left them. She carried the bags inside, the smell growing stronger with each step. It clung to the hallway, settled into the fabric of the rug. The house felt warmer than usual, though the thermostat hadn't been touched. Matthew was in the kitchen, standing by the sink with a mug in his hand. His sleeves were rolled up, and there was a faint dusting of ash on the cuff of his shirt. He looked at her briefly, his face calm, almost neutral. Before his gaze drifted back to the coffee in his cup, she set the grocery bags on the counter without speaking. The silence was thick enough to slow every movement. She could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the click of the baseboard heater cycling on. Then she went to her office. The space was just as she'd left its desk chair pushed in. Curtains half-drawn, but when she turned to the shelves, her breath caught. The middle row, the one that had held the box of journals, was empty, not rearranged, not shifted. Empty. The small indentation in the carpet where the box had rested was still visible. Like a shadow that refused to fade, she didn't call out. To him, she stood there for a long moment, taking in the absence, letting the fact of it settle over her. He would have had to force it. She imagined the sound, muted by the closed door. While she had been choosing tomatoes under the bright grocery store lights, when she turned back toward the hallway, the smell was stronger, a smell that felt like erasure. Back in the kitchen, she asked where the box was. Her voice was steady, but she could feel the weight of the words between them. He didn't answer right away. He took a sip from his mug, set it down carefully, and said, "Some things are better forgotten." She didn't move. He didn't elaborate. Through the window over the sink, she could see the faint wisp of smoke still curling upward from the fire pit in the driveway. The drizzle from earlier had stopped, leaving the air damp, but not enough to smother the flames quickly. Somewhere in that ash were years of her handwriting. Folded and pressed between covers she had chosen herself. She thought about walking outside to see for herself, but she already knew the smell was enough. The heat radiating off his clothes was enough. She put the groceries away in silence. He stayed where he was, watching her without watching her, the way he always did when he wanted her to absorb the message without the words being spoken. By the time she went upstairs, the smoke outside had thinned to nothing. The shelf in her office remained empty. In tone, they almost didn't match the weight of what they meant. Claire stood in the kitchen, one hand resting on the counter, the other still holding the last of the grocery bags she hadn't yet unpacked. The sentence had been delivered without edge, without heat. It might have sounded to someone else, like advice the kind an older relative might give about a lingering grudge or a bad memory. But she knew better. She asked again, her voice quieter this time, careful. "Where are they, Matthew?" He didn't look at her when he answered. His gaze stayed on the coffee mug in his hand, the slow swirl of liquid as he tipped it back for a sip. "Some things are better forgotten." The exact same words. He set the mug down with a precision that made the soft tap of ceramic against marble sound deliberate. Then he turned toward the doorway. No explanation, no attempt to soften it, just a measured step past her, the faint scent of smoke in the wake of his movement. She watched him go, her pulse slow but insistent in her ears. There was no denial in what he'd said, no pretense of confusion or misunderstanding. In its place was something colder, a certainty that he had acted and didn't feel the need to justify it. The kitchen felt too still, the hum of the refrigerator. It seemed louder than it should have been. She had imagined over the years what it would be like if the journals were ever lost. A flood, a break-in, some accident that stripped the shelves bare. But in every version of that fear, there had been a scramble to save what she could. A sense of loss shared with someone who would understand. Not this. Not the quiet certainty that the destruction had been intentional. And by the person who knew exactly what they meant to her. Her eyes flicked to the window above the sink. The fire pit was visible in the corner of the yard, a thin curl of pale smoke still drifting upward. She couldn't see inside from this distance, but she didn't need to. The smell in the air told her enough. She wanted to go out there to see for herself if anything had survived, even a corner of a page. But some instinct told her not to. Not yet. She could picture him watching from somewhere in the house, seeing her sift through the ashes, knowing exactly what she was searching for. That was part of the game. Not just removing the object, but making her carry the knowledge of its absence in silence. Claire opened the refrigerator and began unpacking the groceries. One item at a time. Bread on the counter, milk on the shelf, carrots in the crisper. The rhythm kept her hands busy, kept her from speaking the words forming at the back of her throat. If she accused him outright, if she demanded an explanation, she knew the conversation would turn into something else entirely. He would tilt his head, give her that measured look, and ask why she was making such a big deal over old notebooks. He would recast the act as kindness, a release from the burden of dwelling on the past by the time she placed the last carton of eggs in its spot. She could hear his footsteps moving down the hall toward his study. The faint click of the door. Closing followed, not loud enough to be a slam, but final enough to tell her she would not get anything more from him tonight. She stayed in the kitchen a while longer, her hands resting on the edge of the counter. There was a moment, brief but vivid, when she imagined going upstairs, retrieving the hidden drive from its false bottom drawer and setting it on the table where he could see it. A silent declaration that he had not erased what he thought. He had, but she didn't move. That part of the truth would stay hers for now. Instead, she turned toward the window again. The smoke outside had thinned to almost nothing, dissipating into the gray of the late afternoon. The fire was gone, but the smell lingered, and so did the knowledge that this was not an accident, not a misunderstanding. This was a choice. He had told her exactly what she needed to know in 7 words. And then he had walked away. There was no sudden rise in her voice, no demand for him to look her in the eye and explain. She didn't rush past him toward the fire pit, didn't fling open the back door to drag the blackened remnants into the kitchen as proof. Instead, Claire let the quiet sit between them like a thick layer of glass. She met his eyes for only a moment, then gave the smallest nod, an acknowledgement without agreement, acceptance without consent. Her hands were steady as she reached for her coat. She didn't say she was going out, didn't ask if he wanted. It was a choice. One she had learned over the years could be more unsettling than anything she might say. The evening air met her in a rush as she stepped outside. It was colder than she expected, the kind of cold that seeped past her coat and settled in her bones. She walked to the car, keys in hand, and slid into the driver's seat. The interior smelled faintly of the grocery store paper bags, produce, a trace of coffee from the cup she had bought on the way home. She didn't start the engine. Through the windshield, she could see the glow of the porch light casting its familiar circle on the walkway. From this distance, the house looked like any other on the street, warm, inviting, untouched by whatever had just taken place inside. There was nothing about its outward appearance that would tell anyone that a part of her had just been deliberately erased. She sat there for a while, hands in her lap, letting the cold creep into the cabin of the car. The ticking sound from the engine as it cooled was steady, unhurried. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and went quiet again. She didn't try to replay the conversation. There was hardly anything to replay. A single sentence delivered with the kind of calm that turned it into fact. No negotiation, no room to open it up and pull apart the logic. If she spoke now, she knew the frame would shift instantly. He would begin shaping the moment into something else, something she would have to defend herself against. That was the part she had learned to anticipate. Silence, she had discovered, could be armor. It didn't give him anything to twist. It didn't give him a starting point to pick apart her reasoning or cast doubt on her certainty. And in that silence, she could think. She could picture the safe deposit box 2 towns away, the small, sleek drive resting in its plain envelope, and the knowledge that everything he had burned still existed in perfect order. He didn't know that, and for now, that imbalance was hers to keep. The porch light flicked off after a while, the motion sensor deciding there was nothing worth illuminating. She watched as the windows on the first floor went dark one by one until only the faint glow from his study remained. She could imagine him there, leaning back in his chair. The sound felt loud against the stillness of the street. She didn't drive anywhere. She simply let it idle for a minute, the heat beginning to push back against the cold that had settled in the car. Then she turned it off again, the quiet rushing back in. It was late when she went back inside. The kitchen was empty, the grocery bags neatly put away. She hung her coat, walked upstairs, and past his study without stopping. The door was half closed, the thin line of light spilling into the hallway. She didn't glance in. She didn't want to give him even the smallest sign of what she was thinking. In her own room, she sat at the edge of the bed, the dark pressing clothes around her. She knew the smell of smoke would linger in the air for days, just faint enough to remind her of tonight without overpowering it. But the real memory, the one she would keep, was the stillness of the car in the driveway, the cool air on her face, and the knowledge that she had chosen not to hand him anything he could use. Silence wasn't surrender. It was a line drawn in a place he couldn't see. The drive was small enough to disappear in her palm. Just another unremarkable piece of plastic and metal in a world full of them. No one would have guessed it held decades of her life, thousands of pages, each word typed by her own hands in the quiet hours when Matthew was elsewhere. She'd chosen it carefully, not for its brand or speed, but for its plainness. The kind of object a person's eyes would pass over without registering. It didn't even live in the same town. The safe deposit box she rented was in a modest bank 2 towns over, a squat brick building with no drive-through window and a parking lot that was never full. She'd signed the rental under her maiden name and paid the fee in cash, She'd felt an odd sense of ceremony. She had slipped it inside a plain manila envelope, the flap sealed with a strip of clear tape. There was nothing written on the outside, no label, no identifying marks, and inside the envelope, the drive rested alongside 2 unrelated items: a copy of her grandmother's locket and a bundle of outdated insurance policies. The idea was simple. Even if someone opened the box, they'd be looking for valuables or legal documents. A nondescript USB drive would mean nothing to anyone but her. She visited the box twice a year, never on a predictable schedule. Sometimes in spring, sometimes in autumn. Always during the day, usually after she'd told Matthew she had errands to run in the next town. The bank staff barely looked at her. She was one of dozens of middle-aged women who came in with grocery bags and canvas totes, their lives invisible outside those quiet transactions. Every visit followed the same rhythm. She'd sign the ledger, be escorted to the small windowless room, and have the box set on the table in front of her. She'd check the drive first, plug it into the slim, travel-sized laptop she kept only for this purpose, confirm the files were intact. The encryption solid, the drive would go back into its envelope, the envelope back into the box, and the box back into the vault. By the time she left the bank, it was as though the visit had never happened. There was another copy, of course a twin to the one in the vault, hidden at home in a false bottom drawer, in her office, but that one was a stopgap, a way to keep her work accessible without risking the whole archive. The drive in the bank was the master record, the one she trusted completely. Matthew didn't know about any of it. He thought the journals were her, record the tangible proof of whatever she felt she needed to hold on to. He had no reason to suspect there was a second, silent archive, one immune to fire and locked behind layers of security he wouldn't know how to begin to break. That was the part that steadied her now. In the wake of the fire pit and the smell of burning paper that still clung faintly to the walls, he believed he had wiped away years of her life with one afternoon's act. He believed the record was gone, and she was content to let him believe it when she pictured the safe deposit box. She thought not of the building or the vault or the envelope itself, but of the files inside, words lined up in neat digital rows, untouched, complete. They were her witness, her ledger, her unaltered memory, and they were beyond his reach. If the day came when she needed them, they would be there. Until then, they waited in the dark, locked away with the patience of something that knew its time would come. The journals had begun as a place for Claire to untangle her own thoughts, but over time they had evolved into something more deliberate, more structured. The early years were scattered with the kinds of entries any teenager might write: fleeting, crushes, disappointments, small victories at school. She stopped thinking of them as diaries and started treating them as records. There were still the personal notes, the small, private moments she wanted to hold on to, but they shared space with an entirely different kind of writing. She recorded dates with precision, noting the time of day and where each conversation had taken place. She kept track of places Matthew said he was going and compared them later with where she knew he had been. The more Matthew's work drew him into closed-door meetings and vague business trips, the more she found herself documenting not only what he told her, but the gaps in his explanations. When she overheard a phone call in the next room, she wrote down the fragments of sentences she could catch. If she saw an unfamiliar document left on his desk, she described it in detail: the letterhead, the date, the names at the bottom. She never took the papers themselves. The written record was enough. Some entries were mundane but revealing. The exact cost of a dinner, he'd claimed, was casual, but had been charged to a corporate account. the license plate number of a car she saw leaving their driveway late at night, the name of a hotel she overheard while he was speaking too casually on the phone. Other entries carried more weight, the mention of a payment that didn't match anything on their joint accounts, or a reminder from someone named Hargrove to keep the second set of books clean. She never confronted him with these details as she gathered them. That would have changed the nature of the journals, turned them into ammunition instead of a record. She wasn't collecting evidence for an argument. She was building a history. That couldn't be erased. It wasn't paranoia. It was the understanding, born over years, that the truth had a way of disappearing if it wasn't preserved. Some of the most carefully written entries had nothing to do with business. They were about people who came to the house, who called after hours, who seemed nervous when Matthew entered a room. She noticed patterns, the way certain names would vanish from conversation after a few months, replaced by others. Sometimes, she'd see the same faces reappear years later, always with a new story, dates of transfers, amounts written exactly as they appeared on statements. The shifting balances of accounts she wasn't supposed to know existed. She never speculated in the journals. There was no guessing, only what she could confirm. If she wasn't certain, she wrote down the question itself and left space to return to it later. It wasn't lost on her that some of what she recorded could be damaging, even dangerous, if it were ever read by the wrong person. That was part of why she had been so careful, not just with the journals themselves, but with the digital copies, the encryption, the backups. The thought of anyone else seeing them without her consent was unsettling, but she also understood the power they held. Matthew, she suspected, had always thought of her writing as private musings, perhaps an indulgent habit she'd never outgrown. He had never asked what filled those pages, never seemed to consider that they might hold anything beyond reflections and grievances. That assumption had been her shield. In truth, the journals were a map of years, of movements, of connections. Matthew had worked to keep invisible. They were a timeline that threaded together personal and financial truths, some of which he would never admit even under pressure. And now, with the paper versions reduced to ash, he likely believed the map had been destroyed. But the map still existed. Every name, every date, every note that might one day matter was preserved in quiet, precise lines on an encrypted drive far beyond his reach. He had burned paper. The history remained. Matthew liked to present the construction firm as a respectable, almost noble venture, the kind of business that shaped skylines and put people to work. In public, he spoke about it in the language of civic pride, framing each project as part of the city's growth, a contribution to its future. But behind the polished veneer, the firm's success was bound up with the people who decided which contracts were awarded. And those decisions rarely had much to do with merit alone. Claire had not been part of the firm, not in any official sense. But there were times when Matthew insisted she attend certain dinners, fundraisers, and informal gatherings. He would phrase it as a request. It would mean a lot if you were there, but she knew there was no real choice in the matter. These events were where relationships were maintained, where a casual word over drinks might shape a deal weeks later. The meetings followed a pattern she could recognize after the first few. There was always a central table, the seating arranged in a way that made certain people's proximity to Matthew. The city council members never talked directly about contracts. Claire learned to listen for the spaces between words. She noticed how often the conversation would shift just as a waiter approached, or how Matthew would steer her into a side conversation with a spouse while the real discussion happened at the next table. She didn't drink much at these events, partly because she didn't enjoy it, and partly because staying clear-headed meant she caught more than Matthew realized. Her journals recorded the details Matthew probably thought she missed, the names of council members and their aides, the companies that always seemed to appear on bid lists, the subtle way someone would mention a design adjustment that just happened to increase the project's budget. She noted the restaurants where the meetings took place, the timing of follow-up calls, even the kinds of gifts that appeared afterward, bottles of wine, engraved pens, tickets to exclusive events. One evening in particular stood out in her memory. It had been a private dinner at an old Italian place downtown, the kind with dark wood paneling and booths that kept conversations contained. Matthew had insisted she come, saying it was important for optics to have her there. The man seated across from them, a senior council member, spoke almost entirely in euphemisms. He praised Matthew's efficiency and discretion. remarked on the firm's ability to make adjustments when the city's needs change. Between the courses, Matthew and the council members' aide exchanged a folded envelope as casually as if it were a business card. Later in the car, Matthew had told her the evening went well. He didn't mention the envelope, but Claire had already noted the exact time it changed hands and which pocket Matthew had slipped it into. She wrote it all down when they got home, including the fact that the next morning, Matthew made a call to a subcontractor he hadn't spoken to in months. There were dozens of entries like that, small threads that, if pulled together, formed a much larger picture. She never speculated in the journals, never accused him of anything directly. She simply recorded what she saw, what she heard, and when it happened. Over time, the pattern became clear even without interpretation. Matthew seemed to assume that because she wasn't in the room for the official negotiations, she couldn't understand the scope of his dealings. What he didn't realize was that the pieces he left in plain sight were enough to construct the rest. She had documented every such event she'd attended, right down to the color of the folders that council members carried and the phrases they repeated like coded signals. The journals contained not only a record of Matthew's business, but a record of the way it was done. The unspoken agreements, the exchanges hidden in plain view. And now, with the paper copies gone, he likely believed those memories had burned away with them. But they were still there, preserved word for word, name for name, in a place where his reach ended. Every dinner, every meeting, every folded envelope still existed in the quiet precision of her archive, waiting for the day they might be needed. The glass had slipped from her hand almost in slow motion, though she knew it had happened in an instant. One moment it was steady between her fingers, cool and solid. The next, it was gone, hitting the tile floor with a sharp crack that splintered into a dozen smaller sounds as shards skittered outward. For a heartbeat she stood still, watching the water spread, glinting as it caught the overhead light. Then the sting registered. A thin red line opened across the base of her palm, bright against her skin, the blood gathering faster than she expected. Matthew was already in the doorway. She hadn't heard him approach, but he must have been nearby. He didn't rush forward, didn't make any move at first. His eyes went from her face to the broken glass, to the widening smear of water, then back to her hand. The silence between them was absolute, thick enough that she could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the drip of water from the counter's edge. She bent slightly, instinctively starting to reach for one of the larger shards, but stopped. When she saw how much blood was already on her skin, her hand throbbed in time with her pulse. Still, she didn't say anything. Matthew stepped forward then, but not quickly. He crossed the kitchen like someone arriving late to a meeting they weren't sure they wanted to attend. His gaze stayed fixed on her injury, though his expression was unreadable. She thought for a moment that he might tell her to be careful, that it was dangerous to leave broken glass on the floor. But he said nothing. When he was close enough, he didn't reach for her hand. Instead, he opened the drawer near the sink, pulled out a dish towel, and held it out to her without meeting her eyes. It wasn't tossed or shoved at her, but it wasn't offered with gentleness either, just an object handed over, as if he were giving her a tool she'd asked for. She took it, pressing the fabric against the cut. The towel was rough against her skin, its faint smell of detergent mingling with the metallic temps of blood. He stayed there for another moment, watching as though assessing whether she would manage it on her own. Then he stepped back, leaving the glass on the floor, and moved toward the counter. There were still no words, none from him, none from her. Yet something in the air had shifted, not a sudden eruption, but the quiet adjustment of pressure, like a room where the windows had been sealed without anyone noticing. It was in the way his eyes lingered on her hand just a fraction too long. Before turning away, it was in the fact that he hadn't moved to help clean up the mess, or even suggest she sit down. She knelt to gather the larger shards, careful to keep the towel pressed against her palm. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each piece of glass placed into the trash one at a time. She was aware of him standing a few feet away, his back turned now, the sound of water running as he rinsed a coffee cup that didn't need rinsing. When she finished, she rose, her hand still wrapped in the towel, and placed the broom back in its corner. He didn't look up. The silence remained intact, but it was no longer neutral. It carried something unspoken, an awareness on both sides that neither was willing to name. Later, after she had washed and bandaged the cut herself, she would think about that moment. How he had been there from the start, close enough to see the glass slip, close enough to act faster than he did. She would wonder if the delay had been deliberate, if there had been something in watching her bleed that gave him a certain satisfaction. But in the kitchen, in that moment, all she had was the shift in the air, the sense that the line between them had moved again, subtly but decisively. It wasn't a fight, and it wasn't an act of kindness. It was something else entirely, a quiet reminder that he was always watching, always deciding how much to give and how much to withhold. And she understood, without either of them speaking, that this was meant to be remembered. It was late when she did it, the kind of late when the house was still, but not yet settled into sleep. Matthew was upstairs in his study, the muted murmur of his voice on a phone call seeping faintly through the floor. Claire sat at the small desk in her office, with the lamp turned low, the circle of light pooling just enough to illuminate her, hands on the keyboard. The page she had chosen sat open on her screen, a single document pulled from the thousands she had stored. Chosen not at random, but with deliberate care. It was dated 3 years earlier. The entry was plain, written in her usual factual tone. No embellishments, no interpretation. It described a payment of $42,500 made to an individual named Robert N., a man she had never met, but whose name had appeared twice before in her records. The payment had not come from any of Matthew's visible accounts. She had traced it to a separate line item buried in the firm's budget under consulting fees, a category Matthew often used when he wanted to keep something from scrutiny. The page held nothing but the facts, the date, the amount, the method of transfer, and the notation Matthew himself had scrawled on a sticky note she'd found on his desk for discretion. She had never asked him about it. She had simply recorded it, filed it among the others, and left it alone. Tonight, she extracted it from its folder and saved it as a standalone file. The act felt strangely mechanical, her fingers moving with the same quiet precision she used when transcribing her older journals. She didn't linger over the content. She already knew it by heart. What mattered was what she planned to do with it. The private email account had been hers for years, set up under a name that wasn't hers, with recovery information tied to nothing traceable. She rarely logged into it. It existed for the sole purpose of holding things she wanted far away from her daily life, things she didn't want even touching her main devices. Unless necessary, she logged in now, the familiar login screen feeling like the doorway to a hidden room. She attached the page to a new message addressed to the same account, ensuring that the document would live both in her sent folder and her inbox. It was a simple loop, one she had tested before with innocuous files. She didn't type a subject line or body text. There was no need. The act wasn't about sending a message to anyone else. It was about creating an additional node in the web of backups she had been quietly building, but it was more than just a backup. Choosing this particular page was intentional. She wanted to see it there, in a place only she could reach, as a reminder of what she held. She wanted to feel the faint, steady hum of having a piece of leverage out in the digital ether, existing separately from the rest of the archive. After sending it, she closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the dim light, listening to the sounds above her. The phone call had ended. She could hear Matthew moving in his study, the faint creak of the floorboards as he crossed the room. She pictured him, unaware of what she had just done, unaware that a fragment of his carefully managed world now sat preserved in a form he couldn't touch. It wasn't a threat, not yet. It was a test, a way of dipping a toe into the current. Without sending ripples large enough to reach him, she told herself it was about security, about making sure her systems worked the way she needed them to. But there was something else underneath, something sharper. The knowledge that she had the ability to act quietly, invisibly, in ways he couldn't anticipate. Before going upstairs, she logged out of the account, cleared the browser history, and powered down the laptop completely. In the morning, nothing in her office would look different. No sign would remain of the decision she'd made tonight, but the page would be there, floating in its sealed corner of the digital world. Waiting. And in the days to come, she would think of it often, not with urgency, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has confirmed, beyond any doubt, that the lock on their door still turns smoothly and that the key is theirs alone. The announcement came in the form of a glossy postcard slipped into their mailbox, the kind of campaign material that usually ended up in the recycling bin without a second glance. Matthew had left it on the kitchen counter, half covered by the day's mail. But the bold letters at the top caught Claire's attention. Thomas Greeley for mayor. The name landed with an immediacy she couldn't ignore. She had heard it before, not just in passing, but spoken with intention. In a place where names were currency and their mention carried weight, it had been almost 2 years earlier, at a private dinner that Matthew had insisted she attend. She remembered the low light of the restaurant, the corner table tucked away from the rest of the patrons, the way Greeley had leaned back in his chair, as if the whole room were his to command at the time. By his constituents, and quietly influential in the city's planning committee, the dinner had been arranged, Matthew told her, to strengthen a connection. What he didn't say, what he never said directly, was that such connections were rarely about friendship, obligations. Claire had been seated across from Greeley's wife for most of the meal, making polite conversation about schools and neighborhood improvements. But her attention drifted, as it often did, to the exchanges happening just beyond her. Reach. Greeley and Matthew spoke in the kind of shorthand reserved for people who had already agreed on the essentials and were only refining the details. She caught phrases, "Timing is everything," "No paper trail," "Quiet until the quarter ends," that might have meant little to anyone else. It was toward the end of the evening. The promise, it wasn't stated as a promise, of course. It was framed as a willingness, a readiness to help ensure things moved forward without obstacles. But Claire heard it for what it was, a commitment of resources, financial or otherwise, in exchange for something unstated. Later, in the car, she had asked casually if the dinner had been productive. Matthew gave her a sideways glance, a half smile, and said only it was worth the time. He didn't mention the sum he'd agreed to contribute or the method by which it would be delivered, but she had already written it down that night, along with the location of the dinner, the exact date, and the fact that Matthew had left with Greeley's personal cell number saved in his phone now. With the campaign flyer in her hand, the pieces aligned in a way they hadn't before. If Greeley won the mayoral race, the influence Matthew had secured in that dinner would grow exponentially. The favors promised would not fade with time, they would compound. And the memory of that evening, preserved in her records, might become more significant than even she had realized when she first wrote it. She tucked the flyer into a drawer in her desk rather than discarding it. It wasn't just a reminder, it was a marker, a point on the timeline she'd been building. She opened her encrypted archive that evening and created a new entry, cross-referencing the campaign announcement with the notes from the dinner 2 years before. She attached an image of the flyer, scanned and stored alongside the original record. Matthew didn't mention the campaign in the days that followed, though she noticed a slight uptick in his evening absences, the last-minute meetings that pulled him away just after dinner. She didn't ask where he was going. She didn't need to. The pattern was already familiar. Seeing Greeley's name in print brought with it a strange static that the past she had recorded was still unfolding, still influencing the present. And as she thought back to that dinner, the promise Matthew had made, and the smile Greeley had worn as they shook hands, she understood that some events take years to reveal their full meaning. This was one of them, subtly enough that someone less attuned to him might not have noticed. A question dropped into the middle of an otherwise ordinary conversation. He'd ask, "So, where are you heading this morning?" As she reached for her coat, his voice even and almost casual, or meeting anyone in particular. When she mentioned she'd be out for coffee, the tone was wrapped in warmth, light enough to pass for curiosity. But Claire had lived long enough beside Matthew to recognize the difference between interest and inquiry. The shift came after a stretch of weeks in which their routines barely intersected. He had been busy with what he called urgent developments at the firm, and she had let the space between them widen, moving through her days without offering details he didn't ask for. When the questions began, they seemed harmless. Still, there was something about their timing that made her pause. They came when she was on her way out the door, when her plans couldn't be easily altered, and when she had no reason to believe he'd care. Soon, it wasn't just the occasional question. It was a consistent pattern, with Matthew slipping these inquiries into conversation, no matter how mundane the outing. He'd nod as she answered, but never quite dropped the subject. "You'll be back by dinner," he might ask, even if she'd already said so. "Who's going to be there?" Would follow any mention of meeting a friend. The false warmth was the most unnerving part. It wasn't the clipped interrogative tone he used when annoyed, nor the icy silence that signaled his disapproval. It was something softer, coded in an almost affectionate interest, the kind people use when trying to convince you they're asking because they care. To someone else, it might have seemed thoughtful. To her, it was a warning. Claire knew how Matthew operated. He rarely confronted directly, unless it served him to be overt. More often, he gathered information quietly, piecing together details, until he had the full picture, without revealing how much he knew. She suspected that was what he was doing now, building a map of her movements, her contacts, her habits outside the house. One afternoon, after returning from coffee with an old friend, she noticed a subtle change in his expression as she walked. Through the door, it wasn't disapproval exactly, more like calculation. He asked if her friend was well, if they'd had a good time. The way he lingered on her answers made her feel as though he was listening for something else, something. Beneath her words, she began adjusting the way she responded, not lying, but offering less. If she'd gone to the bookstore, she'd simply say she'd been out. If she met someone for lunch, she'd mention the meal, but not the company. She made mental notes of his reactions, the way his eyes narrowed. Slightly, when her answers were too general, the way he would circle back hours later with a "by the way, who was it you met today?" As though it had just occurred to him, it became clear that he wasn't asking because he wanted to join her or because her schedule mattered for practical reasons. He was tracking her, looking for patterns, a way to keep her from bristling or pulling away. She thought about what might have prompted it, whether it was tied to something in his own world, some deal or risk that made him uneasy about what she might be doing. Or perhaps it was about control, about reestablishing a sense of knowing where she was and who she was with at all times. She didn't confront him. Instead, she let him keep asking, offering just enough to satisfy without revealing more than she chose. In her encrypted archive, she began a new section, documenting these exchanges, the questions. It was tedious work, but she knew better than to dismiss the pattern as meaningless. The warmth might have been false, but the intent beneath it was sharp and deliberate. She could feel it in the way he lingered in the doorway when she was leaving, in the way his voice followed her down the hall. It was the same tone he'd used with others when trying to draw out information without seeming to pry a tone. She now realized was less about kindness and more about control. And as she recorded each instance, she felt the same quiet resolve that had guided her for years. He could watch, he could ask, he could try to wrap his questions in whatever false gentleness he liked. But she would decide what he learned and what he never would. Claire first noticed Alice because she was the kind of person people overlooked. Small-framed, her hair kept in a neat gray bun, glasses balanced low on her nose. She moved through the library with the quiet assurance of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged. Claire had been using the library more often in recent months, drawn to its stillness and the anonymity it offered. She came to work at one of the far tables with her laptop, sometimes transferring files, sometimes reviewing entries from her archive. Alice approached her one afternoon after noticing Claire struggling with the library's printer. It wasn't a conversation Claire expected to last more than a few minutes, just a quick explanation of the settings, but Alice lingered, her manner gentle but curious. She didn't pry into the content of what Claire was doing, only asked about the process, as though she were more interested in how information moved than in what it contained over the next few visits. Their conversations became more regular. Alice spoke about her years as an archivist at the County Historical Society, about the systems she'd used to preserve fragile documents, the redundancies built into every storage method. She had a fondness for the small details of preservation, the right humidity level for paper, the best way to scan bound volumes without damaging the spine. Claire listened, filing away every piece of advice. One day, over the faint hum of the library's heaters, Alice leaned closer and said, "The trick isn't just having a backup. It's having backups of backups, in places no one would think to look." She told Claire about dispersed storage, how a collection could be broken into parts, each stored in a separate location, so that no single point of failure could destroy it. Claire didn't share what she was working on. She never mentioned Matthew, the journals, or the archive, but Alice seemed to sense that, whatever it was, it mattered. "If it's worth keeping," she said once, "it's worth making sure. It can't be erased." She spoke from a lifetime of guarding records. other people might have found inconvenient in the weeks that followed, Alice showed her how to use encrypted cloud services registered under pseudonyms, how to disguise file types so they appeared as harmless images or music files, how to hide a text document inside an innocuous-looking photo. She explained the value of physical redundancy, to how to store drives in climate-controlled safe deposit boxes, how to use archival-grade materials so that years wouldn't degrade the data. They worked in the quiet rhythm of the library, Alice pointing out methods as if they were just discussing general archival practice, never asking why Claire was taking such an interest. The unspoken agreement was clear. Alice didn't need to know the content, and Claire didn't need to explain it. Once, when the conversation brushed close to motive, Alice paused, studying her over the rim of her glasses. "I don't need to know what it is," she said softly, "but I can tell it's important to you, important enough that you'd regret losing it." Claire simply nodded, and that was the end of it. By the time spring came, Claire's system of backups had expanded, far beyond what she'd originally planned. She now had encrypted drives stored in 3 separate locations, cloud copies under different identities, and fragments of data hidden in files that would look meaningless to anyone without the right key. None of it would be obvious, even if Matthew searched every inch of the house. She never told him about Alice, never mentioned the afternoons she spent in the library under the pretext of researching old neighborhood records. The less he knew, the better. And though Alice remained unaware of the specifics, her guidance had become the quiet scaffolding holding Claire's work together. It wasn't friendship in the usual sense. It was something more pragmatic, built on trust without disclosure. A kind of alliance that allowed Claire to safeguard what mattered without risking exposure. Alice had given her the tools, and Claire had used them to build a fortress. Matthew could neither see nor dismantle, and each time she left the library with her laptop bag over her shoulder, she felt the same small surge of certainty. Whatever happened next, the record would survive. The story appeared on a Tuesday morning, buried halfway down the home page of a small, unassuming local blog that most people in their town only read when it covered a zoning dispute or a feel-good profile. About a bakery, the headline was measured but pointed. Questions arise over unreported expenditures at Weller and Price Construction. Claire might have missed it entirely if not for the alert she kept on the firm's name, a habit she'd maintained ever since she began her archive. The piece was short, maybe 4 paragraphs in all, and careful with its wording. It didn't accuse, but it implied. The article cited documents obtained by a source familiar with the firm's operations and mentioned a pattern of off-book payments routed through shell contractors. No specific projects were named, but the examples bore a resemblance to figures she had seen before, the kind she had quietly recorded in her files. It wasn't her doing. She knew that immediately. She had been disciplined about keeping the archive private, about never letting even a hint of its contents slip where it could be traced back to her. This was someone else's hand at work. But even without her involvement, the effect was undeniable. The ground beneath Matthew's carefully managed image had shifted. She saw it in the way he read the article at the kitchen table, his phone in one hand, coffee cooling beside him. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his thumb hovering over the screen as though he might erase the words if he pressed hard enough. He didn't speak, didn't look up, just sat there for a moment longer before setting the phone down and, pushing his chair back with a little too much force, the rest of the day unfolded in fragments. Matthew made a series of terse phone calls, his voice low and clipped in the study. At one point, she overheard him telling someone to get ahead of this and to find out who's talking. He left the house twice without saying where he was going. Each time, his movements were sharper, more deliberate, as if he were containing something volatile. Claire didn't ask. She kept to her own rhythm, tending to her errands, making tea, answering emails. But inside, she felt a slow awareness settling in the knowledge that cracks were appearing in the structure he'd built. This was not the kind of problem Matthew could control, with a smile at a charity gala or a donation to a local committee. It was the kind that lived in records, in ledgers, in the hands of people who had nothing to lose by speaking by evening. The blog post had been picked up by 2 other small outlets. The language stayed cautious, but the repetition gave it weight. She watched the progression like someone tracing the first tremors of an earthquake, knowing that most would dismiss them until the shaking grew stronger. Matthew was quieter that night, the kind of quiet that didn't invite conversation. He ate dinner without remark, barely glancing up from his plate. When he finally spoke, it was only to say, "People like to make trouble when they don't have the full story." He didn't direct the comment at her, but it hung in the space between them. Claire nodded, offering no agreement and no contradiction. She didn't need to add anything. The truth was, she didn't know who had leaked the information or what else they might have, but she knew with absolute clarity that this was how it began. Not with a dramatic public reveal, but with a small, almost forgettable piece tucked into the corner of a local blog. She thought of the thousands of pages in her possession, of the records far more detailed than anything hinted at in the article. Her archive was not a weapon she intended to use recklessly, but the events of the day made one thing certain: she wasn't the only one keeping track. Others had seen enough to start speaking, and Matthew, for all his confidence, could no longer be sure where the next leak might come from. The unease that crept into his movements was subtle but unmistakable. He had always been the one to control the narrative, to anticipate threats. Before they reached the surface, now someone else had made the first move, and it wasn't her. That fact alone seemed to unsettle him more than the article's contents. Claire didn't celebrate it. She simply observed, storing away the details, the exact wording of the headline, the time of its first publication, the way his hand lingered too long on the edge of the table before he stood up. All of it went into her record. All of it became part of the larger story, the one that was still, for now, hers alone to tell. It was unusual for Matthew to arrive home before sunset on a weekday. He preferred to make an entrance walking in just as dinner was plated, bringing with him the faint scent of expensive cologne and the polished ease of a man who had been admired all day. But that afternoon, Claire heard the front door open at least 2 hours early, the sound sharper than usual, followed by the quick, restless rhythm of footsteps crossing the hardwood floor. He didn't call out to her. Instead, the steps moved straight into the kitchen, where he began pacing in a tight loop between the island and the sink. The usual smoothness in his movements was gone, replaced by something taut and impatient. His phone was in his hand, his thumb hovering over the screen without tapping it, as though he couldn't decide whether to make a call or throw it away. When he did speak, his words were short, each one clipped clean at the edges. "We need to talk later," he said without looking at her, his tone making it clear that later was not a request, but a delay, a way to hold control over the moment. He opened a cabinet, closed it without taking anything out, then pulled open another and did the same. The gestures had no purpose. He was moving because stillness made him feel exposed. Claire stayed seated at the table, hands wrapped loosely around her tea mug. She knew better than to fill the silence with questions. If he wanted to tell her something, he would, and if he didn't, pressing him would only make him retreat further into whatever calculation was running behind his eyes. Instead, she studied him the way she'd learned to study storms, looking for the signs of direction, speed and strength, before they broke into something visible. The smile that usually framed his face, the one that smoothed over tense conversations and made strangers instinctively trust him, was nowhere to be found. In its place was a faint compression at the corners of his mouth, a tightness that didn't quite relax even when he exhaled. His charm, the weapon he carried into boardrooms, fundraisers, and small-town gatherings, had been set aside. What remained was leaner, stripped down, and less certain. He poured himself a glass of water, but didn't drink it, just set it on the counter and stood there, staring at the surface as though it might give him an answer. When he finally turned to her, his gaze lingered too long, as though he were deciding whether she already knew what was bothering him. She met his eyes briefly, then looked away, letting him think what he wanted. It was in moments like this that Claire could sense the hairline fractures forming the subtle shifts that others might overlook. Matthew was still in control of his posture, his tone, the cadence of his sentences, but not completely. Something had pressed against his confidence, hard enough to leave a mark. He left the kitchen without explaining, disappearing into his study and closing the door with more force than necessary. She heard the muted rumble of his voice through the wall, the sound of his desk drawer sliding open, the rapid tap of fingers on a keyboard. The conversations were half muffled, but she caught phrases like "containing it" and "who else?" Knows, each one confirming that whatever had shaken him wasn't small. When he emerged, half an hour later, his expression had smoothed over slightly, but not enough to erase the tension. He moved with more deliberation now, as though aware she was watching, as though he'd remembered to put the mask back on but hadn't fastened it fully. Claire didn't ask where he'd been or who he'd called. She didn't need to. Seeing the moment the first crack appeared, the absence of his smile, the clipped precision of his words, the way he'd paced without direction. It was enough to know that the foundation he relied on wasn't as solid as he liked to believe. And, as he left the kitchen again, she let her tea grow cold, sitting in the stillness he had disrupted. The image of him pacing stayed with her, not as a moment of triumph, but as confirmation that no one, not even Matthew, could carry that kind of composure forever. Something had shifted, and she intended to remember exactly how it looked. When it began, the house was quiet by the time she made her way to the study. Matthew had gone to bed early, claiming he had an early morning meeting, though she suspected it was less about sleep and more about retreat, withdrawing into the dark where no one could read his face. The faint hum of the refrigerator carried through the stillness, and the only light came from the desk lamp she switched on. After closing the study door behind her, she set her laptop on the desk, the familiar weight of it grounding her. From her bag, she took out the small, unmarked black drive she kept hidden in a false bottom compartment. Her fingers were steady, but she was aware of the way her pulse picked up the moment the connector clicked into place. The drive didn't hold everything. The full archive was dispersed, scattered across locations and platforms, but this one carried enough. Enough to matter, enough to change things. The folders were named innocuously, each one referencing a year and an event, so ordinary it could pass without notice. Yet she knew exactly where to go. She scrolled past the surface level of documents and opened the directory labeled Council Dinner to 2018. Inside were files named with dates, cross-referenced with audio snippets, scanned documents, and typed transcriptions. She remembered that night, clearly, the long table in the private dining room at the Belmont Hotel, the gold-patterned wallpaper, the smell of overcooked salmon. She had sat at Matthew's side, smiling politely, while the council members laughed over inside jokes and spoke in a language that sounded harmless to an outsider but was weighted with implications. She'd begun making notes as soon as they got home that evening, while the conversations were still fresh in her mind. The way one councilman mentioned a fast-track approval for a project that had never gone to public review. The list of names recited quietly after dessert, people who would need to be taken care of before the mayoral election. The promise Matthew had made, casual in tone, but firm in intent to direct funds through an intermediary so they couldn't be traced. The file held more than her words. There were receipts she'd photographed when the folder of papers had been left unattended on a side table. An image of the seating chart with certain initials circled in red. Even a short recording captured on her phone under the pretext of checking a message, where a man's voice spoke openly about the importance of keeping the right people in place. She sat back in her chair, scrolling through each piece of evidence, the quiet weight of it settling over her. For years, she had written, documented, and stored without acting. Her archive had been her insurance, her silent defense against the erasure she knew he was capable of. But tonight, as she reviewed the folder, she felt the line shift inside her. It wasn't only about protection anymore. The leak in the news, his pacing in the kitchen, the cracks in his composure, they had shown her that he was no longer untouchable. Something had already started unraveling, and she could choose to let it run its course or help it along. Her cursor hovered over one of the audio files. She thought about what it would mean to let it slip into the right hands, not a public release not yet, but a carefully chosen recipient who could connect it to other threads. The thought carried risk. It also carried a certain inevitability. She closed the folder without playing the recording, forcing herself to move deliberately. This wasn't a decision to make impulsively. If she acted, it would have to be precise, measured, and impossible to trace. But the choice itself had been made the moment she opened the drive. Claire ejected it from the laptop, slid it back into its compartment, and turned off the lamp. As she left the study, she glanced toward the darkened hallway that led to their bedroom. The air felt different now, heavier but also clearer, as though she had stepped into a version of herself she had been moving toward for years. She didn't know the exact day she would act, or the exact shape the action would take. But she knew this much: the contents of Council Dinner minus 2018 would not remain in the dark forever. and when they emerged, it would not be by accident. She waited until the house was still, the kind of stillness that made every sound feel amplified. The curtains in the study were drawn, the door locked, and the desk lamps, light pooled across the surface like a stage she had stepped onto alone. She moved without hesitation now, her earlier deliberations replaced by a calm, methodical focus. The laptop came out first, placed squarely in front of her. Then the black backup drive, retrieved from its hiding place, the connector clicking softly as it locked into place. She didn't need to search. She already knew the exact path to the file. Council dinner to 2018. The name looked almost harmless, just another note from a busy calendar, but she knew what it held. The contents had been reviewed and cross-checked so many times that she could have recited them from memory. She had followed the journalist for years, quietly from a distance. His work wasn't flashy. He wrote for a mid-sized investigative outlet, the kind that broke stories not with sensational headlines, but with documents, interviews, and verifiable detail. She had watched him dismantle small-town corruption in places that had counted on no one looking too closely. His bylines appeared on stories that didn't vanish after a day. They lingered, picked apart in council meetings, and whispered about in boardrooms. His email address wasn't hard to find, public for tips and sources, but she had never used it until now. She created a new account on a secure, encrypted platform, one that didn't carry her name, her location, or any trace of her history. She didn't add an alias, no subject line, no text in the body. The file would speak for itself. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad before she dragged the audio file into the message window. The progress bar filled in slow increments, a small, deliberate climb toward the point of no return. She watched it without blinking, the weight of the decision settling not as panic, but as an almost physical quiet. When it finished, she clicked send. The screen refreshed, and the message disappeared from the outbox into the encrypted void. That was it. No confirmation, no acknowledgement, just the knowledge that somewhere, in a digital queue far from her reach, the file was moving toward the one person who might know exactly what to do with it. She closed the laptop and unplugged the drive, sliding it back into its compartment. There was no reason to linger in the study now. The action was done, irreversible. Still, she didn't leave immediately. She sat in a low light, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness beyond the lamp's circle. Upstairs, she could hear the faint rhythm of Matthew's footsteps as he moved from the bedroom to the hallway and back again. He didn't know that the night had shifted, that something irreversible had been set in motion. To him, the silence was still just silence. She stood, finally, switching off the lamp, and opened the study door. The air outside the room felt colder, or perhaps she had simply been sitting in the warmth too long. She walked through the house, without turning on lights, her steps soundless on the carpeted hall in the kitchen. She poured a glass of water and drank it slowly, her hands steady. She wasn't thinking about what would happen next, not about the journalist's reaction, not about the ripples the file might cause. For now, it was enough to know that the contents no longer existed in just one place. They were out there, beyond her control, immune to Matthew's reach. When she finally went upstairs, she found the bedroom light still on. Matthew was in bed, propped against the headboard, reading something on his phone. He looked up briefly, offering the kind of neutral nod that passed for good night between them these days. She nodded back, climbing into bed without speaking. Lying there in the half-light, she closed her eyes, the quiet pressing in around her. Somewhere out there, an unread email with no subject line sat waiting to be opened. And when it was, the words and voices inside would begin a story Matthew couldn't stop. The call came mid-morning, while the light outside still held that pale, cool tone of early hours. Claire had been in the kitchen, rinsing a coffee cup, when the phone on the counter vibrated against the wood. The number was unfamiliar, no name, just a string of digits from an area code she recognized but couldn't immediately place. She let it ring out. Whatever it was, she wasn't ready to answer. A minute later, the voicemail icon blinked. She dried her hands slowly, almost ritualistically, before pressing play. The voice was male, steady but edged with a tension that suggested he knew exactly what he was holding. "If this is true," he said, each word measured, "you're holding dynamite. Call me then." A pause, as though he'd considered adding more, before the line clicked off. She played it again. Not because she'd missed the words, she hadn't, but because she wanted to hear the tone. He hadn't wasted time on pleasantries or introductions. The message was stripped to its core: urgency, gravity, and the understanding that this was not the kind of thing one stumbled into. By accident, setting the phone down, she moved to the table and sat, her fingers resting lightly against the grain of the wood. She thought about the file she'd sent, the deliberate simplicity of the email, and the choice not to identify herself. She had given him nothing beyond the material itself, yet it had been enough to prompt that message. The idea of calling him back carried its own weight. It wasn't fear that kept her still, but calculation. The moment she spoke to him, the shape of the situation would change. Silence, she knew, had a kind of power. It allowed her to remain undefined, untraceable. A conversation would anchor her to the material in a way that couldn't be undone. Still, she found herself replaying the sound of his voice in her mind. It didn't have the slickness of someone fishing for information. It had the clarity of someone who had already seen the edge of a story and knew how far it could reach. The word dynamite wasn't careless. It was a warning as much as it was a promise. She left the phone on the table and moved about the rest of her morning. Matthew was gone, off to a meeting he'd left for in a hurry, his suit jacket draped over one arm as he walked out the door. The house felt larger without him in it, the quiet more complete. From time to time, she glanced toward the phone, half expecting it to ring again. It didn't by noon. She had listened to the message 4 more times. Each replay was like holding an object up to the light, inspecting it from a new angle. She imagined him in an office, the file open on his screen, weighing its authenticity against the patterns he'd seen in other stories. She imagined his desk papers spread out, a notepad filled with names and dates that mirrored her own records. She didn't delete the voicemail. Instead, she saved it, moving it into a hidden folder on her phone. Not because she planned to use it, but because she understood that everything, every word, every exchange was part of the record now. By late afternoon, she had made her decision. She wouldn't call, not yet. She would give him the space to investigate on his own, to see what he could verify without her voice on the other end of the line. If he was as skilled as his work suggested, he wouldn't need her to lead him to the truth. And if he did, then perhaps he wasn't the one to carry it forward. The message remained quiet and untouched as the day faded into evening. Outside, the light shifted toward that muted gold that made the walls of the house seem warmer than they were. Claire stood at the window for a moment, watching the shadows stretch across the yard. Somewhere, far from her kitchen, a reporter was working through a story whose first thread had come from an email with no name, and for now, that was exactly where she wanted to remain, the unseen hand holding the rest of the fuse. For the next 2 days, Matthew's voice became a near-constant presence in the house, though rarely directed at her. The calls began early, sometimes before breakfast, when his phone would vibrate sharply on the nightstand. He'd answer in a low tone, already moving toward the door before she was fully awake. By the time she came downstairs, she'd find him pacing in the study or standing at the far end of the kitchen with one shoulder pressed to the glass of the back door. Eyes fixed on the yard, but clearly seeing something else entirely. He had always been a man who valued privacy, but this was different. The moment she appeared in a room, his hand would cup the receiver, or his voice would drop even lower, syllables clipped into fragments she couldn't follow. If she lingered too long, he would step out into the hall or close the door with deliberate slowness, as though to give the impression of courtesy when the intent was exclusion. Claire didn't ask who was on the other end. The not knowing was more useful than any answer he could give. It allowed her to watch without reacting, to take note of the new patterns forming. He was calling more often, for longer stretches, and when he hung up, he rarely returned to what he'd been doing before. Instead, he'd stand still for a moment, phone in hand. His jaw set in a way that suggested the conversation hadn't ended so much as paused. From her seat at the dining table, she could hear the rhythms of his voice even when she couldn't make out the words, short bursts, then longer responses. A tone that alternated between coaxing and sharp, as though he were moving between persuasion and control. Every so often, a name would slip through, half swallowed but distinct enough for her to catch. Some she recognized from years of overhearing his business dealings. Others were new, unfamiliar. the syllables carrying no immediate associations but heavy with importance nonetheless. In the evenings, he stayed off speakerphone, holding the device close to his ear as he leaned against the kitchen counter or stood. In the shadows of the hallway, the calls were shorter then, more abrupt, punctuated by pauses that seemed to stretch longer than the actual words exchanged. If she passed by, he would glance at her, quick and assessing, before looking away. There was no change in his outward routine. He still left for meetings, still returned at predictable hours, but the edges were fraying. She noticed the way he double-checked that his phone was in his pocket before leaving a room, the way he set it face down when he wasn't using it. At night, the device stayed on the nightstand, but now it was flipped over, the screen hidden. The sound turned low enough that she couldn't hear the alert tones. She didn't need to imagine the cause. The file she had sent was no longer just a document sitting in a journalist's inbox. Whatever threads he was pulling at, they were reaching Matthew now. She could see it in the way he moved, not with the easy rhythm of a man in control, but with the compressed energy of someone bracing against an unseen push. By the end of the second day, even the silences between calls had changed. He was more present in the house, but less connected to it, as though the walls themselves had become temporary. He drifted from room to room, not to spend time in them, but to find a place where he could stand and speak without being overheard. Claire let him. She went about her routines without interruption, each closed door and hushed word reinforcing what she already knew. The perimeter he had built around his life was being tested, and he could feel it. Whatever he thought he was protecting with those calls, it was slipping through faster than he could contain it. And all she had to do was wait. The envelope was waiting for her in the late afternoon, tucked among a thin stack of mail that had been pushed halfway through the brass slot in the front door. She noticed it immediately, not because of any markings, but because of the absence of them. No return address, no stamp design beyond the standard issue. Just her name, printed neatly in block letters that revealed nothing of the hand that wrote them. She carried the stack into the kitchen and set the rest aside without looking. The envelope was light, almost weightless, the paper inside shifting softly when she turned it over. For a moment, she simply stood there with it in her hands, aware of the way her fingers pressed into the thin surface, aware of how deliberate the choice had been to send it like this. When she tore the flap open, it came apart cleanly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. She unfolded it slowly, the edges crackling faintly, and found herself looking at something she knew instantly. Down to the slope of the letters and the faint smudge of ink in the upper corner, it was her own handwriting, a photocopy of one page from a journal she had written 6 years earlier. She didn't need to read the whole thing to recognize it, the looping script, the spacing between lines, the indentation she used for every date. Still, she read it from beginning to end, her eyes following the familiar curve of words she hadn't seen in years. The entry was precise. Written the night of the council dinner in 2018, it described the setting, the sequence of conversations, and the moment Matthew had leaned in to confirm the payment arrangement with the councilman across from him. Every detail she had typed into the digital archive later was there. But here it was in its original form, unfiltered, unedited, as she had written it at her desk that night. Her first reaction wasn't surprise, but recognition. The reporter had chosen this page deliberately, not the typed version, not the audio recording, but the handwritten original, proof that he had received what she'd sent, proof that he understood exactly what it was and that it came from her. Even if her name had never been in the email, there was no note enclosed, no instructions, no request for a call. The page itself was the message. It told her he had the material, that he had already verified its source, and that he knew she would understand what it meant to see her own handwriting returned to her. She folded it back along the same crease and slipped it into the envelope again. The edges were warm from her hands now. She considered where to put it, knowing instinctively that she couldn't leave it anywhere Matthew might come across it. In the end, she slid it between 2 cookbooks on the top shelf of the pantry, a place he never looked and never would. The light outside had shifted by the time she stepped back into the kitchen. Shadows stretched across the floor, the day thinning into evening. Somewhere in the house, Matthew's phone rang, his voice low as he answered, the words indistinct. She stood at the counter, the empty envelope still in front of her, and thought about the line that now connected her to the reporter. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't an arrangement. It was a single, undeniable piece of evidence, sent back to her an acknowledgement that the file had moved from her hands into his, and that he was holding it carefully. It was proof of life, not for a person, but for the truth she had been keeping for years. And now she knew it was no longer locked away in the dark. It was out in the open, breathing. The dining room was quiet, except for the faint clink of silverware against porcelain. The overhead light, softened by its frosted glass shade, cast a muted glow over the table. Claire cut into her food slowly, her mind half on the meal and half on the letter now hidden between two cookbooks in the pantry. Across from her, Matthew seemed preoccupied, his fork idle on the edge of his plate, the wine in his glass untouched. When he finally spoke, it was without preamble, his voice steady but with an undertone she recognized instantly, the low, controlled register he used when he wanted to send a message without making it sound like one. "People are making things up," he said, as if commenting on the weather. He lifted his fork then, spearing a bite, but his eyes didn't follow the motion. They stayed on her. The words might have been casual, but the pause that followed wasn't. It stretched just long enough to register, the space between them charged in a way that made the air feel heavier. Claire kept her expression neutral, her gaze steady but not confrontational. She had learned over the years that silence could be as much a statement as any reply. He took the bite, chewing slowly, and then set the fork down again. "It's incredible," he continued, his tone edging toward disbelief. "How people will twist things, take an innocent conversation, and turn it into something it's not." He sipped his wine, watching her over the rim of the glass. Sometimes it's malicious. Sometimes it's just carelessness. It was a performance, she realized, the shape of an argument presented without the context to make it explicit. He was giving himself room to deny it later, if he needed to. But the focus of his attention left little doubt about who he wanted the words to land on. She set her knife and fork neatly on her plate, aligning them as though the small act required all her concentration. "That does happen," she said finally, her voice even, offering no invitation for him to push further. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, the kind of change only someone who had lived beside him for years would catch. He leaned back in his chair, one hand resting on the table, fingers tapping lightly against the wood. "It's dangerous," he said, "especially now. People don't check facts. They just believe whatever they're told." Claire nodded once. As if in agreement, inside, she could feel the quiet shift, the way his language was probing for a reaction, for some hint that she might confirm his suspicion or betray her involvement. But she had no intention of giving him that. If he had connected the recent tension in his world to her, it was only a suspicion, not a certainty. The rest of the meal passed in measured exchanges, neither of them acknowledging the change in tone. She spoke about the weather turning colder, about the renovations on the house down the street, about a neighbor's new dog that barked through the night. He responded in kind, but the conversation had become a framework, something to fill the air, while their real attention stayed fixed on the undercurrent running between them. When the plates were cleared, he gathered the dishes and carried them into the kitchen without another word. She followed after a moment, standing at the counter while he ran the water, and began rinsing them. His shoulders were tense, the movement of his hands deliberate. "You have to be careful," he said finally, without looking at her. The phrasing was deliberate, the kind of warning that could be dismissed as general advice if repeated. She let the comment hang there, neither accepting nor rejecting it. Then she turned, walked to the pantry, and retrieved a bottle of sparkling water, her hand brushing the spine of one of the cookbooks, without pausing when she returned to the table. He was watching her again, the hint of calculation in his expression. If he had realized anything, it was only enough to make him wary. And for now, that was exactly where she wanted him. Uncertain, watching and wondering how much she knew, the park was nearly empty when Claire arrived, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the patchy grass. A few joggers passed on the outer trail, their rhythmic steps fading into the distance, and somewhere behind her a dog barked once, before its owner called it away. The air held that crisp, in-between quality, not quite warm, not quite cold, and the sky was a washed-out blue that made everything below seem sharper in contrast. She spotted him before he saw her. The reporter sat on a bench near the middle of the open lawn, his posture relaxed, but with an alertness that was unmistakable. He wasn't reading or looking at his phone. He was simply there, waiting. Claire slowed her steps, scanning the area without making it obvious. No one lingered nearby. No faces seemed turned toward them with too much interest. When she reached the bench, she didn't sit immediately. Instead, she walked past, circling around to approach from the other side. Only then did she lower herself onto the wooden slats, leaving a space between them. Neither of them spoke at first. The quiet was deliberate, a way to feel the edges of the moment before breaking it. From her coat pocket, she withdrew a small, unmarked USB drive. She placed it on the bench between them, the faintest click of plastic against wood marking the sound. He didn't look at it right away. Instead, his eyes stayed forward, following the slow movement of a child flying a kite in the distance. "Came?" he said finally, his tone even. "I came," she replied. Her voice carried no emphasis, no inflection to suggest anything beyond the obvious. He shifted slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, and glanced at the drive. "What's on it?" "Everything you didn't get before," she said. "Names, dates, copies of documents, enough to see the full picture." Still, he didn't reach for it. "You're certain you want to hand this over?" he asked, his eyes finally meeting hers. "Once it's out, it's out. You can't pull it back." Claire met his gaze without hesitation. "That's the point." The reporter studied her. For a moment longer, before picking up the drive, he didn't pocket it immediately. He held it loosely in his hand, turning it once between his fingers, as if weighing its significance. "I won't ask your name," he said, "but I need to." "No. Do you understand what this could do?" "I've understood for years," she said quietly. "That's why I wrote it all down." They sat in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. A breeze moved through the park, carrying the faint rustle of leaves from the few scattered trees. In the distance, a whistle blew, someone calling a game to an end. Finally, he slipped the USB into his jacket pocket, the motion discreet. "I'll verify everything," he said. "I won't move on it until I'm certain." She nodded. "You will be." There was nothing else to exchange, no further negotiation or reassurance. Claire stood first, smoothing the front of her coat, and began walking toward the path that would take her back to the street. She didn't look over her shoulder, though she felt the weight of the moment settling behind her. The drive was no longer in her possession. The information, the years of carefully kept truth, had crossed into someone else's hands as she neared the edge of the park. She passed the child with the kite, now struggling as the wind dipped. The bright fabric fluttered and then steadied. Rising again, she kept walking, the sound of the kite's string humming faintly in the air, and knew the shift had already begun. Somewhere behind her, the reporter would be leaving too, the bench now empty except for the impression of where they had sat, the small space between them carrying the weight of what had just passed. It began in the early morning, before the street outside had fully stirred. Claire found the newspaper folded neatly on the porch, the plastic sleeve beaded with condensation. She carried it inside without thinking, the routine so ingrained that it wasn't until she set it on the kitchen counter that she saw the headline. The words were impossible to miss, heavy black type spanning the width of the front page, the kind of font reserved for things that could not be ignored. Beneath it, Matthew's name appeared in bold, followed by a string of phrases that sliced through the years of curated image he had built: financial misconduct, illegal contributions, fraudulent contracting. She didn't have to read the article to know what it contained. The lines were already etched in her memory from the documents she had handed over, the dinners she had attended, the overheard conversations she had written down in her journals. Now they were no longer confined to her pages. They were public record. Her coffee cooled beside her as she read the first paragraphs. The story named his construction firm directly, detailing the city council contracts that had been awarded without proper bidding, the payments routed through shell accounts, the political favors traded in back rooms. Dates were listed, meeting locations, names of those who had been present. It was all there, not everything she had given, but enough to open doors that could no longer be closed by the time she reached the bottom of the column. Her phone had begun vibrating on the counter, unknown numbers. Calls she didn't answer. The screen lit again and again, each time with a different set of digits, some local, some not. She slid the phone into a drawer and let it ring. Outside, the world was waking up. A delivery truck idled at the end of the block, brakes hissing. Across the street, a neighbor stepped out in a robe to retrieve their own paper, pausing for a long moment as they read the front page before glancing toward her house. Claire stepped back from the window. The television in the living room murmured. Faintly, she turned it on to find the same story already on the local news. Grainy photos of Matthew at ribbon-cutting ceremonies played in sequence, his handshake with a council member frozen mid-smile. A reporter stood in front of City Hall, the words "breaking investigation" scrolling along the bottom of the screen. Behind her, a cluster of microphones had already been set up for statements that would come later in the day. She could picture Matthew's reaction without seeing it. The phone pressed hard to his ear, the clipped orders to his attorney, the sudden calls to partners and allies, testing who would still answer, who would still stand beside him now that his name was printed in ink for everyone to see by mid-morning. The news had spread beyond the city. National outlets picked up the story, reprinting the same photograph of Matthew in a tailored suit, his expression caught between confidence and calculation. Online, the headline was shared and reshared, comments piling up beneath each post. Some defended him. Others speculated about the scale of the corruption. Claire sat at the table with the paper still open before her. The smell of newsprint mixed with the faint bitterness of her untouched coffee. She felt no rush of triumph, no surge of satisfaction, only a quiet clarity, as if the noise of the last several years had been turned down just enough for her to hear her own thoughts again. Contracts were already being frozen, the article said. Investigators had been assigned, subpoenas would follow. She knew the process would be slow, messy, public. She also knew there was more to come, more than what had made it to print this morning. But for now, the truth had broken the surface. Somewhere, Matthew was reading the same words she had read, seeing his name framed not in the glow of accomplishment, but under the weight of accusation. And unlike the stories he had once been able to control, this one was out of his hands. The apartment was small, but it was hers. The walls were still bare, the faint smell of fresh paint lingering in the corners. Outside the single large window, the city moved at a steady, distant hum. Traffic lights changing, buses sighing to a stop, the occasional burst of laughter from someone walking below. Claire sat at the small wooden table by the window, the same table she had once used in their old kitchen, now stripped of its polished centerpieces and placed in a room that needed nothing more from it than to hold her hands and her words. A fresh notebook lay open before her, its first page unmarked. She had bought it only the day before from a bookstore 2 streets over, its cover a deep, muted blue that felt cool beneath her fingertips. No dates on the inside cover, no scribbles, no history, just clean pages waiting to be filled. The pen moved smoothly across the paper as she wrote the date in the upper corner, the way she always had. The words that followed came without hesitation. Backup, complete. Story told. He never saw it coming. She paused for a moment after the last sentence, reading it over as if it were a record for someone else's eyes, though she knew it was only for her. The phrase held more than it said. Backup complete wasn't just about files or encrypted drives. It was about years of preparation, the careful stacking of details in places no one could reach until she decided to release them. Story told meant the truth was no longer confined to her, no longer at risk of being burned away like the pages that had turned to ash in their driveway. And he never saw it coming was not a boast, but a fact. Matthew had lived his life convinced he could read her every move, that her silence meant submission, that her stillness meant absence of thought. She set the pen down and let her hand rest on the paper, feeling the faint warmth of the ink drying. In the corner of the table sat her laptop, the one she had used to type the final additions to the archive before leaving their house for the last time. The encrypted drive was gone from her possession now, in the hands of people who would see the process through without her needing to hover. She had no desire to follow every headline, no interest in watching the slow unraveling of his world. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint tick of a clock on the shelf. She had no television, playing no radio, no voices filling the air. After years of measured conversations and the unspoken threat behind certain silences, this kind of quiet felt different, clean, without weight. On the counter, a single mug sat beside the kettle. She poured herself tea, the steam curling upward. As she returned to the table, through the window, the city's pace was unchanging. People crossed streets without knowing who she was or what she had done. There was comfort in that anonymity, in the fact that her name was not the one in bold on the front page. She thought briefly of the old house, of the shelves where the journals had once lined up in neat rows, of the night she had slipped the last of them into boxes without a sound. That house was no longer hers, and she felt no pull toward it. The rooms would carry their own silence now, empty of the record she had kept. The notebook in front of her was the start of something separate, not evidence, not insurance, not a ledger of things to be used later, just a place to write without. Looking over her shoulder, she turned the page, the paper smooth beneath her fingers, and began again not with the details of deals or dates, but with the sound of the city outside her window, the way the late light shifted against the walls, the smell of the tea cooling beside her. Whatever happened next in Matthew's world would happen without her. The story had been told. The backup was no longer hers to guard, and here in this small apartment, with a pen moving across clean pages, she understood that the ending she had written was only the beginning of her own